I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman, and in today's interview I am talking with atheist Graham Oppy, who is Professor of Philosophy at Monash University. Graham Oppy has written many papers and books on the subject of philosophy and atheism and theism, including Atheism, The Basics, which I have behind me. It's a really good introductory book on atheism. It's very succinct and it covers a lot of ground. And as well as this, ground that hasn't necessarily been discussed in the majority of mainstream atheism books. So he, for example, goes into the philosophy of defining atheism, how we come to the best explanation of what atheism genuinely means, unlike the more popular labels that the new atheists like to use, such as Lack-Theism, for example. He also, in the book, goes through the history of atheism and cites many underrated and unknown atheists that I didn't know about, and that was a nice surprise. So the book overall is a look at what atheism is and going through some of the mainstream perceptions of what atheism is seen to be and either debunking them or affirming them. For example, Graham Oppy in the book doesn't believe that atheism is the default position like many atheists tend to proclaim that it is. In this discussion, myself and Graham talk about defining atheism, going through some arguments for atheism which he finds most convincing. We also discuss new atheism, what he thinks of Christopher Hitchens' work, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins. I also had the opportunity to ask him what it would take for him to believe in a God, what sufficient evidence would have to be posed to him, and as well as this, which religion he would jump to if he were to temporarily suspend his atheism. In the hour that we spoke, we certainly went through a few topics. Please let me know what you think of this discussion in the comments section, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a like, and if you're new here, subscribe for more content on literature, philosophy, discussions. If you want to help the channel out the most you can, then you can sign up to my Patreon, where you can get additional benefits and early access to videos such as these. This discussion was incredibly interesting. Graham Oppy is one of my favourite atheists of the modern age. I think his work is so good, and I love watching all of his discussions, interviews on YouTube. Hopefully I've added to the pool another discussion that maybe some questions weren't asked before, and I got something out of Graham that other people may not have. With this out of the way, let's get straight into the video. I hope you enjoy. Graham Oppy, it's an utter pleasure to have you on the channel. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So your book, I wanted to begin with promoting your book because it really is a great piece on atheism. It's great to, define atheism, to go into the representatives of atheism, and also to kind of examine interesting cases, actually. How many people actually are atheist, how many people are not atheist. I found that the book was quite unique in that regard because, from what I've read anyway, a lot of atheist books focus on maybe arguments more than they do defining. As they don't spend as much time on really going through the nitty-gritty parts of the subject as much as that book. And I think that is its highlight. And I also wanted to say, when I was reading it, and it was the chapter on I can't remember what the actual title of the chapter was, but it was essentially when you were going through the different atheists throughout history, right? And it's really funny because a lot of the atheists you cited, you actually admitted we can't verify that they were even atheists, and I found it quite humorous that you were adding them anyway, because just because we can't verify that, it doesn't mean that what they left behind was not of value. And I've read, for example, John Gray and his Seven Types of Atheism, and that was a really interesting book. I don't know if you checked that out, but in that he actually does a similar thing throughout the whole book, rather than you doing for a segment. And he did a really good job of that. But I liked your approach because it was you made the effort to go through the atheists who are far less known and that was actually quite refreshing. And I had the search engine readily open to try and find their books and their works. So yeah, your book, Atheism: The Basics, I'd recommend it to everyone who's watching. It's a really good, succinct book on atheism. So yeah, thank you for writing that. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
So one thing I might recommend is another book. If you're interested in the history of atheism and you want to know about atheists, I reckon the Encyclopedia of Unbelief that Tom Flynn edited is a really great resource. So I relied on that a bit to find things to chase up. And
Okay.
there are people who know a lot. I mean, sadly, Tom passed away recently, but there are people who know lots and lots about the history of atheism, and their work's really worth diving into if you're interested in it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I do find it quite interesting how atheists can represent themselves so differently because of course everybody's an individual, and because of that everybody's going to have their own perspective of atheism and their own definitions. And that brings me to the first question for you. Now, how do you define atheism? Because I know that you have a very succinct answer in your book, but I wanted you to share it with the audience and also explain how you actually came to that definition, because definitions are not really as set in stone as we might think. Do you disagree, or how did you come to that definition?
So, so we can start with that, right? I think that with lots of terms in regular use, people use them differently. And if you were to try to define your use of the term and someone else was to try to define their use of the term, they might come up with different definitions, and that would be fine. It doesn't necessarily lead to difficulties so long as each person knows how the other one's using the word. And with a word like atheism, there's contestation about it in two directions, because there are people who don't want to be atheists because historically it's had all kinds of negative connotations, and then there are people who do want to be atheists because in certain ways it has certain positive connotations now, as sort of free thinking,
Yeah.
perhaps slightly radical, whatever. So when I'm defining atheism, I'm just saying how I use the word, and there are a couple of considerations. One of them is that the way I use it is the way that professional philosophers do. So in the people that I'm regularly in discussion with in journals, they're using the term atheism more or less as I do. The other thing is that the way that I define the word fits a much broader pattern of definition of terms, and gives you a kind of neat classification of a whole lot of things, and also enables you to highlight certain features of, for example, the social scientific literature that are very easy to highlight if you understand atheism the way I do, and much more difficult to highlight if you use a different set of terms. Anyway, so all of that's just by way of background. So for me, to be an atheist is just to deny that there are any gods. That's it, full stop. So the characteristic sort of thesis of atheism is there are no gods, and an atheist is someone who believes or accepts that claim, full stop.
Yeah, because there's this, and I'm sure you've heard of it, this Lack-Theism title, that the new
Yeah.
atheists like to propose. What do you think of these alternate kind of definitions of atheism? Because as far as I'm concerned, they're either in an attempt to, uh, I don't know, maybe turn the debate another way in some sense, to try and shift the burden of proof, or at least to reduce it, to some extent.
Mm.
Um, where's Lack-Theism come from? Yeah,
So I think that your diagnosis is right. It's people who are hoping to get some dialectical advantage through definition. But against alert opponents, that's not going to work. And if you think about typical debates with presuppositionalists, who I think do something rather similar on the other side, if you come up against someone who knows what they're doing, you get no mileage whatsoever from the definition of terms, because we will sort out a way of having our conversation that moves away from what depends upon definitions and get to the substance of, the issues. And so the question, one sort of question that there's going to be for the Lack-Theists is, well, are they agnostics in my terms, or are they atheists? Do they really think there are no gods, or are they just undecided about whether there are gods? And we can have that discussion without ever mentioning the words atheism, agnosticism, and so on. We can just talk directly about the question about gods. And that's where I would shift the conversation to. And then if you're thinking of theists as people who think that there's at least one God, or in particular, if you're thinking about monotheists who say there's one sort of capital G God, we've now got something very clear to discuss. And and there's a bunch of positions that we might have. Some of us will think there are no gods. Some of us will think that there's a particular God. Some of us won't be sure. Some of us will never even have thought about it, right? Won't so much of us formed an opinion. And that just seems straightforward and didn't rely on any special way of defining the contested terms, atheism, agnostic, and so on.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I can't remember the phrase that you used, but I was thinking from one part of what you were saying, when people claim that the default position of is atheism, right? And when I read that in your book, and you kind of you rejected that claim, that atheism is the default position. Now, to be honest with you, I've held the view that it is. Although when I read your book, I was like, that's curious. That's an interesting. You're not on that side of the debate, and I'm wanting to get your more advanced thoughts on that.
So, I mean, it seems to me that there's no kind of default position when it comes to existence questions generally. For some things, it's just obvious to all of us that there are such things, like what's the default position about the moon, right? Right. For other things, it's kind of controversial. And then for other things, we're all convinced the other way. So what's the default position about the Easter Bunny, right? It's not like ignoring opinion there's about a whole range of matters that it's just a default position that there's no such thing, or there's a default position that there is such a thing. It just depends what we're talking about. And in the case of the one that we're interested in, the question about gods, there are lots and lots of people who think there are gods. There are some people who think there aren't any. There's nothing that you would think of as the position that you've got to start in with respect to that discussion. And every discussion starts with people already engaged, right? And I mean, it's kind of pointless saying to people who believe in God, look, the default position is not yours.
Would you say it's a sort of category error to bring this neutrality into the question?
I just think it's unhelpful. It's not that. I mean, I do think that there just isn't a default position on existence questions once you start thinking about the range of things which you're going to say, yeah, those things exist. The range of things about which you're going to say, well, I'm really not sure if there are those things. And the things about which you're very confident, you're going to say, no, there's no such thing, right?
So for a while, I've kind of been on the view that agnostic atheism is probably the most, let's say, maybe epistemologically honest, or I don't know, sincere means of thinking about these kind of subject. The subject of God's existence, and the validity of theism and so on. Now, I have talked to some individuals about agnostic atheism, and I know that I think you did support that, but then you went back on it. And I was wondering, do you think agnostic atheism is a valid, like, epistemological position to hold?
So one of the questions here is going to be about what you build into agnosticism. So, I mean, all these terms are contested. And
Yeah.
historically, when Huxley sort of introduced the term and Ingersoll took it up, they were thinking that what the agnostic said is just, I don't know. They weren't thinking necessarily in terms of suspension of belief the way that I do now. And you might think, depending on what your standards for knowledge are, that there can be things that you believe very strongly, but you're still going to say, I don't know. So some people think for knowledge, you need certainty. And so if that's all that's going on, you're saying, I'm not 100% certain that there are no gods, but 99.99%, right? I'm very strongly, right?
Hmm.
If that turns out to be all that agnostic atheism commits you to, then lots of people who just think that they're flat out atheists are going to say, that's my position, right? Because the question about knowledge is just a separate, it really is a separate, or maybe it's not entirely separate, but it's very largely just a separate question from the question about what you believe and how strongly you believe it. Well, at least you can have a view about knowledge, right, on which it turns out that way. And it's tricky because claims to knowledge are just contestable. Do you really know that? Are you really, I mean, when somebody says there are no gods and someone says, do you really know that? Can you prove it? There's various questions that might come up. If you just say, look, I'm near to certain that there are no gods, none of those questions are going to arise.
Yeah, because I think that I have thought this position was reasonable is more to the fact that it's actually quite convenient, because when I'm having discussions with theists, it's far more encouraging from the outset if I say, by implication, basically, I'm open to being wrong, I'm open to, theism. But if I just say I'm straight up an atheist, right, there's this connotation with atheism that I found that is quite negative, and the theist might assume, which is on them for sure, but I think the reason why I adopted agnostic atheism wasn't so much that I necessarily thought that it was the more established position to hold, but actually it was more convenient, because when having dialogues with people, it's very easy to jump to conclusions about, this person's an atheist, like Dawkins is an atheist, or somebody, I don't know, like Nietzsche, who is far more open to the critical analysis of things and not so much completely dismissive. Although I did want to go into Nietzsche later, but yeah, I think that, I don't know. Would you say that agnostic atheism, to hold that title, is more confusing than it needs to be, or do you think it is convenient, but is it worth using? Do you think?
Maybe it depends who you're talking to and what their attitudes
Yeah.
are, right? And if people just hear the word atheism and their brain shuts down, right,
Mm.
then there's no point telling them that you're an atheist, right?
Yeah.
You need some different sort of label. But the way that I'm thinking about atheism, there's nothing that says that atheists are any more closed-minded than theists. In fact, there's symmetry. That's part of the point of the definition. The theist just says there are gods. The atheist says there are no gods. This tells you nothing about whether they make claims to proof or knowledge or certainty or anything like that, right? And whatever concerns you might have about atheism, given the way I use the words, you would have exactly the same concerns about theism as
Mm.
well. And that's, I think, something to bear in mind, that there's a kind of symmetry here between two positions. And it shouldn't be that somehow or other people on one side think that there's additional burdens or worries that you have about the one view that you don't have about the other one. If people are going to be moved away from the label atheism because of concerns that make you want to put the word agnostic on it, then the same will be true of theism. They should all be calling themselves agnostic theists for
Mm.
exactly, just by symmetry.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, and I think it's a very important point that you bring up, which is, the atheist by definition, and the definition that you use, and the one that I've, from reading a book, my mind has definitely been altered on many things, and atheism for me has become far more clearer because the book, it actually was very in depth, but also very readable, and so, um, what you said about atheism being, the definition not following certainty, I think that's a really important point to consider for both atheists and theists, because, you know, when I was first getting into this, I would have said, oh yeah, well, the atheist, by definition, the atheist with certainty believes that God does not exist, right? And the theist must therefore believe that, God must exist with certainty. But actually, it isn't like that, because certainty is well, arguably unattainable, or at least
Even if it's
unrealistic. Yeah,
attainable, yeah, I mean, but if you just talk to people, theists and atheists alike, lots of them are going to say, well, no, I'm not certain about those things. That would be absurd to think that you could achieve certainty here.
yeah, yeah.
I might be very confident. In fact, perhaps I'm sort of overconfident, but not that bad.
So I wanted to ask you, what do you think the best argument from your own personal point of view, but of course it would also follow that, from an objective perspective, from your research and from your work, what do you think is the best argument for atheism?
So I actually think the best arguments on both sides are going to follow the same pattern. That is, the best argument for theism and the best argument for atheism have to look kind of similar, because they'll be sort of cumulative case argument that tries to
Mm.
take into account all of the relevant evidence. Right? That has to be, I think, the best argument that you can come up with. So, so the kind of model here would be to think about the case that Richard Swinburne made in his book, The Existence of God, and then the reply, the kind of alternative case that was presented by John Mackey in his book, The Miracle of Theism, just a couple of years later. And there are features of their cumulative case arguments that I don't much like, but that's a kind of model, right? Trying to just take everything into account and arrive at an overall judgment that says, let's say the atheistic position is better than the theistic position. So my own version of the argument of what I take to be the best argument is the one that I presented in my book, The Best Argument Against God. That sort of sets out what it's going to look like. Of course, lots of the details will be wrong in that book, but that's the kind of general idea.
Yeah, so it would be cumulative. I've come to realize as of late that, you know, I don't know, would you say that most of our knowledge, if not all of our knowledge of the world, is down to cumulative, um, induction, and that kind of line of reasoning? Would you say that?
So sort of inference to the best explanation, yeah, abductive reasoning
Yeah,
is fundamental, I think.
yeah,
And there's lots of stuff that's by now seems so well established that we're not going to contest it. And I think the kind of home for this kind of stuff, apart from kind of common sense things like, I remember what I had for breakfast, right? And I don't need an argument, I'm just kind of reliable at remembering that stuff. So there's one sort of area where our kind of knowledge is kind of unproblematic, but the other one is going to be in the sciences. So for example, if we're building bridges, we just use Newtonian mechanics as a framework for doing our calculations, and the bridges don't fall down, right? But then, and there aren't serious questions about whether Newtonian mechanics isn't enormously accurate, right, as an account of reality at that scale.
yeah. So because on one hand, we if something, would you say if something works on a practical level, that indicates some level of truth in that thing?
So it might be something more than that. It might be, and this is closer to the way I'm going to think about it, that there's a kind of independent convergence of expert opinion. So in physics, doesn't matter whether the theory and the experiments are conducted in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Australia, the results are the same, right? And when you go and you ask the experts to give an account of this thing, they all just give the same story, right? And it's not because they've independently conferred or that they've got some text and they're just relying on the same text. It's because they've all got a grasp of this theory and they can apply it in novel situations, and they just always arrive at the same answers, right? It's something like that. So it's actually the kind of independent convergence of expert opinion that's the thing that tells us that we've got a grasp, right? For certain everyday matters, more or less, we're all experts, but we can all agree, so long as we're suitably informed about, what I'm having for breakfast, for example, right?
Yeah.
So I'm happy to think of us all as experts about those sorts of things. Of course, you don't know what I had for breakfast, but that's just because you weren't exposed to the evidence. But if you had been, you would know. When it comes to the sciences, most of us have no idea, right? So think about climate science. Most of us have no idea about climate modelling, how it's done, and so on. But we do know where expert opinion has converged, or at least we ought to, if we're kind of responsible epistemic agents.
So more on like being convinced of arguments and that kind of area. Do you have a model, a kind of a structure of what you would expect in terms of sufficient evidence in order to be convinced that God exists? Because as far as I'm concerned, and I want your view on this, it seems that would it not be rational for each theist and each atheist to be very clear on what they would what would convince them essentially, like, because I think that that sounds reasonable, because if they didn't, by implication, then they wouldn't know the evidence if it hit them in the face, right? So do you think that every atheist and theist needs to have that kind of model? And what about you? Do you have that?
So I actually think that's probably not right. So
Okay.
the way I think about it is that what you do is you've kind of got an ongoing theory which you keep testing out as new evidence comes in, and you've got no reason to revise or to have expectations that you're going to revise your theory independently of acquiring new evidence. So in lots of cases, you won't be able to say anything very interesting about what it would take in order for you to kind of be required to revise. So what would it take for me to revise my view about what I had for breakfast? Right. I mean, there's various things that could happen, but it's not like there's just nothing kind of on the radar that sort of makes sense even to me about how I could be mistaken about what I ate an hour and a half ago. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, I could
yeah.
say there's various things that could happen, like I could have an aneurysm, or you know, maybe I just ingest some drugs, right? Or there's various possibilities, but it's not clear, what sort of evidence, because those weren't really evidence. They were kind of thinking about changes in me, right? If you're thinking about evidence, it's not clear what I could point to, right? What it would take. But I don't need to be able to answer that question in order to just be confident that I'm correctly remembering what I had for breakfast, right?
Yeah, because I'm thinking the maybe you can outline this a bit more, but I'm thinking the breakfast example or analogy might not be suitable to the question of revising the arguments for God's existence,
Mm.
because it seems to me that the arguments for what you ate for breakfast and the probability and things like that, it seems on on a basic level the principles are there, and the um, but to me it seems a bit like it's kind of a different category. One, the God category seems to me more complex and more worthy of attention, if you know what I mean.
So I don't think the principles are different, though. I mean, I think that you're doing kind of inference to the best explanation all over the place, right? And so what would have to happen is that so think about somebody who's weighed lots of considerations for and against, and so that they're familiar with with many of the kinds of things that theists will say about why they believe, familiar with many of the kinds of things that atheists will say about why they don't. They've done their own weighing of all this stuff, and they've come down very firmly on the atheist side, right? In a certain sense, you know what it would take for you to change your mind, right? You would have to weigh things differently. And you're weighing those things differently might be a matter of acquiring some more information, or it might just be that you come to think that you haven't been weighing it properly, so you weigh it a different way, right? But that's not to say that you're thinking, oh, were I to have this experience, or were I to be told by somebody that I really trusted this bit of information, or were I to just change my mind about that thing, that would be the thing that would make me swap, right? You don't have to think anything like that. So this is, think about the Hume's example of the voice from the sky. Hume's thinking, what would it take? What if there was a kind of voice that spoke from the sky to everybody in their own language, so they could all understand it, saying, I'm God, and you, right? I've got no idea what would happen, right? What I would think if I had that experience. I think I would suspect that I was hallucinating, right? That would be the first thing I'd want to do is kind of check with other people. Are you hearing that?
Mm, yeah.
But suppose that everybody did. Well, I don't know, maybe, but something like that simply isn't in the cards, at least not according to me, right?
Yeah.
And kind of speculating about that seems about as useful as speculating about things that would make me change my mind about what I had for breakfast, right? That's the kind of point of the analogy, right? I
Yeah.
don't I don't need to think about that question. It will take care of itself if the opportunity happens along. Right?
Right.
It's
So
just
if
not.
yeah.
It's just not that interesting, right? So you know, pick a whole lot of things that somebody's pretty convinced of. Probably they're not going to have just ready to hand an answer to this question with respect to whatever it is, right? So why think that you would have to have it ready to hand in the case of being a theist or an atheist? What would it take to make you stop being a theist?
Mm.
Right?
Yeah, because I've seen various atheists talk about the topic, like Matt Dillahunty. He's on the same lines of he doesn't know what it would take, and when you were on Unbelievable, Justin Briley asked you what this kind of question,
Yeah.
and he talked about another atheist. I'm forgetting his name now. But it was quite funny actually when that other atheist was on Unbelievable. Is quite a clip. He as Justin admits, you two are very different in your styles of atheism. So when I think of this personally, I mean I'm at the position where I don't know. I'm the same as you, but I get this instinct that would it not be arbitrary to even have these kind of discussions and have the kind of debates and arguments if at the end of the day we didn't actually know what would even convince us. So to me that seems strange, even though I don't even know what will convince me. It seems
Yeah.
strange that I wouldn't have this set kind of format. Yeah.
So, so I guess though, so here's one way maybe of thinking about it. So the other recent book I've got is a debate book with Kenny Pierce. Is there a God? And in it, my kind of rhetorical strategy in the first bit where I get to do my thing is just to say, look, here's more or less an outline of my intellectual framework, my beliefs. And look, there's no God-sized hole anywhere, right? So I've got no reason to believe in God, right? It just doesn't fit with my theory, right? What would it take for me to change my mind? Well, I'd have to find a God-sized hole somewhere, right? That's specific enough, right? I don't have to have a view about where one might actually appear, right? So it's not like I've got nothing to say. It's not like I can't see that I've got absolutely nothing in response to the question, but I've got nothing of detail. And that seems right. It's a bit like if you ask a theist, so, okay, what's it going to take? What's going to, they might not be able to say, well, you know, there's just this particular thread, and if you pull on that one, the whole thing's going to fall apart. It's not like
Well,
that.
for Christianity,
Right?
if Jesus is demonstrated not to be, to not exist, or like Richard Carrier would say, or if he didn't resurrect, then that's actually what you could pull out, and that would destroy the entire thing. So I don't know. In Christianity,
So,
I think that
so
might be true.
that would be difficult though. It's like, I mean, time machines are not in the offing, right? It's going to be fairly difficult to prove, right, that
Yeah,
Jesus didn't
yeah.
exist. And you know, there's reasons. I mean, think about somebody like Bart Ehrman, right, and his views. There's there's reasons why lots of non-believers are still going to think there's something that stands at the origin of Christianity, even if we're really not very sure about what's true about it and what's false about it. And the question really is that I think for Christians, they would have to stop believing that Jesus is God, roughly. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Yeah,
thing that would have to, and that's not going to be delivered by historians, I don't think. You're
yeah.
not going to be able to read that off the historical record. And independently, naturalists have lots of reasons for thinking that it isn't true.
What do you think about the new atheists, and what would you say their best moments were whilst they were thriving, if you could even admit that? And what would you say their worst moments were? Um,
So, yeah, it's an interesting question. Right. So I've written a little bit about new atheism in the Atheism, the Basics book, um, about the extent to which they're rather similar to characters earlier in history. Um, so I mean, the new atheists have several different features. And one thing is that they're atheists, but another thing is that they're quite anti-religion. Right? And another thing is that they're very willing to antagonize people by expressing their opinions forcefully. And so, I mean, if you go back a couple of hundred years and think about somebody like Tom Paine, the third thing is, apart from being anti-religion, they're definitely very strongly anti-Christian. Think about someone like Tom Paine. He's a deist, but put that to one side, he's at least as virulently anti-Christian as the new atheists, and anti-religion as well. And the kind of rhetoric that you get in the new atheists, you can find it in Paine, and you can find it in lots of other people writing on the deist side at the time. So in that respect, their kind of achievement is to bring that stuff, which, like Paine in his day, was very widely read. The Age of Reason was a big seller, right? They managed to shift millions of books, right? And that writing about sort of attacking Christianity, attacking religion, attacking theism. And that hadn't happened for a long time, right? So you can see that as a kind of achievement. I think. Right? That's kind of the kind of tick for them. On the other side, people criticize them because, I mean, especially people who know a little bit about philosophy, because lots of the arguments are not particularly philosophical. I'm not sure that they really care about that, because that wasn't part of their objective. In fact, some of them are really some of people who broadly fit into the camp of the new atheists are kind of anti-philosophy, full stop, right? So where things get tricky is where, on the one hand, they're kind of not interested in the philosophy, but on the other hand, they start trading in philosophical arguments, and by the lights of philosophers, and in particular by the lights of philosophical theists, don't do it very well. Right? And so that's where there's a kind of difficulty, I think.
Yeah, but I completely agree with you that what they did well was actually surface atheism in a well, I was going to say in a positive light. I mean, in some sense, not really, but they did make atheism more relevant um, than it would have been, 20 in the 20 years, maybe. Russell, for example, as we know, was really respected and still is. And I suppose they serve that purpose of resurfacing atheism and putting it forward more strongly. Let's just put it that way, much more strongly than other proponents. I mean, since Nietzsche, maybe. I mean, yeah, perhaps since Nietzsche.
So,
Yeah.
so maybe they had a bigger reach. And I should have mentioned one other kind of negative, which is that many of them are strongly connected to, I don't know, what will we call it, Islamophobia, and a kind of reactionary conservative politics, which, if you don't like those things, is a very big minus, right? So that's another part of what kind of got bound up in the new atheist package.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. There was quite a bit of that, and the term Islamophobia is a really difficult one for me because it's thrown around quite a lot, and especially on Twitter as well, where I've always said that Twitter is the cesspit of
Yeah.
anti-intellectualism, and but I guess Twitter's good for other reasons, of course, but for intellectual discussions and it's mostly point scoring, isn't it? Let's be let's be completely honest.
Yeah.
Um, so talking of representatives of atheism, I was really wanting to ask you what you think of Nietzsche. Do you think his because it seemed to me when I read his books, it seems to me that he always presupposes that God does not exist and instead argues from a more psychological perspective. When you read Nietzsche, are you impressed? Do you think he's overrated? Do you think what do you think the strengths of him are? Do you think he was wrong in any way?
So I think this is going to be very hard to discuss. So my familiarity with Nietzsche goes back a long way. I remember buying a copy of the Viking portable Nietzsche when I was about 15 and reading bits of it, the bits that I could find at all accessible. So the sort of aphorisms from Twilight of the Idols and the first book of Zarathustra and some other bits. When I was at graduate school, I took a course on Nietzsche with Alexander Nahamas, and I read pretty much the entire published corpus of Nietzsche for that course. So I've had sort of some instruction by somebody who really is an expert on Nietzsche, and I have some familiarity with the text. But there's lots of stuff in Nietzsche that I just don't understand at all. I find the rhetoric, the flair with which he writes is enormous, but are there, arguments in the sort of familiar philosophical sense running through these texts that are easy to extract, or even kind of viewpoints? That's much harder to say because that's kind of not his thing. Like, he'll look at something and he'll kind of worry away at it from different angles, and it doesn't seem like you necessarily get kind of resolution and theses coming out at the end. So that's a kind of my general response to Nietzsche. And there are bits of Nietzsche that I really like. There are bits of Nietzsche I don't like too. So, for example, he has some rather cruel things to say about Marianne Evans, George Eliot, which I think are quite unfair. Just to pick one paragraph out of one of his books. And I think Evans was amazing, actually. Lived a really interesting life, and was fully an atheist too, I should say.
Yeah, Nietzsche. Nietzsche's one of those guys who always have an opinion on someone and something. That's for sure, but at least conveyed in an entertaining way to some extent. Do you think his idea of God is dead? Do you think that's being too dramatic? Do you think he wasn't being literal? What's your interpretation of that?
So it's certainly not meant to be literal. I mean, think what's dead is what he thought was dead was a certain kind of belief in God. That when Zarathustra comes down and says, God's dead and we've killed him, that's not meant to be taken. I think it's not meant to be understood literally. It's meant to be understood as, we have this kind of lip service to belief, but nobody believes this anymore, right? It's not, you can't believe it in the circumstances in which we now live, or something like that. That's how I've always understood it.
Yeah, I find it a really fascinating passage in the gay science, and because a lot of theists use it. They use it to say, look, even an atheist has admitted how doom and gloom everything is, with everybody abandoning God's influence and no objective moral values. Although I don't know, I think there's multiple ways to view it in some sense, and yeah, okay.
So there is this question about the extent to which people really had abandoned religious belief or had abandoned Christian belief. I'd have thought that at the time that Nietzsche was writing in Germany, most people actually were still Christian theists, and most of them, in some sense, really believed it. Right? Still, so it's interesting to. Census data maybe doesn't tell you that much, but Australia at the beginning of the 20th century, the first census was in 1901, just after Federation, and the percentage of people who claimed to be Christian was upwards of 97%. Right? I don't think that was just sort of people saying, ticking the box because, I don't know, you had to tick a box. I think people really did believe the teachings of whatever form of Christianity they belong to. And so the kind of reading Nietzsche as being committed to the idea that across the board people had lost belief in God, that wouldn't be plausible either, because I don't think he could have believed that. And maybe he thought that at some deep level, it wasn't really motivating people deeply anymore, or something like, maybe it was something like that he had in mind. But it would be like saying now that in the United States no one believes in God.
Yeah,
which just doesn't seem credible to me at all, given people I know who live there.
Yeah, well, in your book, you do a really interesting job of actually going through surveys and actually explaining why some might be inconsistent, what makes a strong analysis, and that was a really interesting means of kind of questioning these things, because of course, many theists might say, yes, like you were saying in your book, many theists like to say that atheism is declining and things like that. But actually, when it came down to looking at their arguments and their reasonings for it, you managed to kind of delve a bit deeper, and you were like, well, the evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that, and even if it did, there might be some, analytical inconsistencies there. But the whole population analysis, I do agree with you. It's just very difficult to ascertain because, like you say, but on the street or people don't. I mean, if they handed this survey, they're not going to take it seriously if it's a topic they don't take seriously, right? So you can't trust people to do that on a level that you like them to do. Um, I also was interested in
So,
arguing.
I
Yeah,
mean,
go for it. Yeah.
so also just to tie back to something that I said much earlier, the way that the surveys are formulated, it's not clear whether exactly what value you're going to get from answers to the questions that you pose if you use a term like atheism, right? So, are you an atheist? Imagine that question being asked now in the United States. What do the agnostic atheists or the lack-theists do with this? Which box are they going to tick in the survey? You just using those kinds of labels doesn't enable you to get to the kind of questions that are interesting, say, with respect to the social science, right? Because it turns out that I think, I mean, this is controversial, but that the kind of surveys that suggest that there are actually health advantages in being a committed theist, somebody who strongly believes that God exists, are actually kind of misleading because they just group all the non-theists together as a single category and don't single out for special attention, as they should, the people who are committed atheists, the people who are strongly convinced that there are no gods and live their lives accordingly. Because since the 1990s, there's been a kind of minority of research that's been done that makes these distinctions carefully and suggests that there's a kind of U-shaped curve here of kind of happiness and life satisfaction and health and so on, that actually swings with strong commitment, not with what you're strongly committed to, right? And so the idea that there are kind of health benefits to being a theist actually just turn out to be an artifact of poorly designed experiments.
That's really interesting that you bring that up because in my psychology classes, when we were actually, and I, funnily enough, I managed to get the vote over to the does religion increase well-being or something like that, and I was really happy that I got the whole class to do something on that topic, and when we looked into it, I was under the impression, like you suggested, that okay, well maybe theists are they do have a more positive well-being, and I was under the impression that they did, because of what I initially found. But as you said, that was really interesting what you said, that actually it's misleading because they don't look into the particular perspective of the different disbelievers and their nuanced positions that they hold. I'll keep that in mind actually if that comes up again. That's a really good nuance. Um, what if you had to choose? Um, I don't know if you've been asked this question before, probably, but it's a bit on the nose. If you suspended your atheism, right, just for this question, which religion would you find is most convincing that you would probabilistically um, put your vote on?
So it's not really clear that you have to suspend your atheism in order to join a religion, right? It's at least possible that you can be Hindu and an atheist, because after
Yeah,
all, there are Hindu
yeah,
schools
yeah.
that were atheistic, like the Chavaks. Admittedly, they disappeared in the 13th century, and it's not like there's a contemporary school that replaced them, but there could be. right?
Mm.
Similarly, there are stories about people practicing Buddhism who don't believe in gods. I mean, it's kind of tricky because lots of versions of Buddhism have lots of gods, and then there are some that kind of treat the Buddha as a kind of God incarnate. But I think that there are schools of Buddhism that are just outright atheistic as well. And there are other things that you can count as religions that will go the
So
same way. So,
yeah.
so that's one thing. Then there's this other question about whether you can participate in a religion without believing its teachings. So I mean, Robin Lepedvin is one person who's written quite a lot of stuff about religious fictionalism. And the idea is that maybe you can get the benefits of participating in religion without having any of the beliefs. And so that's another avenue that will be open to atheists, would be now, of course, there's some trickiness here because certain kinds of religious believers might not want to have anything to do with people who are actually atheists and who are just kind of engaged in a kind of pretense in order to get the benefits of belonging to the religion,
Yeah.
right? But there are going to be some parts of even Christianity who are just kind of fine with that. Indeed, there are these questions that more fundamentalists will ask about certain parts of the Anglican Church, for example, about whether the people actually really are believers at all, right? Whether they aren't actually already fictionalists about Christianity. And so that kind of part of the Anglican Church would be could be quite hospitable to atheists.
Mm. And in terms of, yeah, I mean that's a really important distinction that you've made in Buddhism in particular. If it were down to the monotheisms, I should have been more specific in fairness. When it comes down to the monotheisms, and in that case, you would quite literally have to suspend it. If you were to join the club, of course. Yeah, which one would you vote
Well,
for
well,
at probability?
well. Again, there's still this question about whether Hinduism is ultimately monotheistic or not. It's just that perhaps there's this kind of impersonal absolute, right? And whether we should think of that as a monotheistic God or not is contentious, right? And if it comes down to choice between personal God and impersonal God, impersonal principle or something like that, I suspect that lots of atheists are going to lean towards the latter. Okay, so there's this kind of impersonal principle that stands at the origin of things, rather than there's this person that stands at the origin of things, right? So there's still the possibility. Now you might say, okay, so I want to refine the question further. Suppose that you're going to go for a personal God. Which one are you going to go for? So that we've kind of narrowed it down more or less to the Abrahamic religions now. Is it, Judaism? Is it going to be Christianity? Is it going to be Islam? If so, which variant of one of those? Or is it going to be something else? Because there are still other things, both within the Abrahamic religions, right, and outside. But those are the kind of, let's narrow it down further. And it's a choice out of those three. Well, now I'm just not going to choose, right? I mean, I do think that there are particular problems about incarnation and Trinity that are not particularly attractive. And so you might think that it would be a choice out of the other two, just on the kind of purity of theory grounds. But you'd have to remember these are institutions with histories as well. And I don't know, I don't really feel much attraction to joining any of them.
So would you say on an equal basis, whether Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, on a basic level, you would, in the slightest, feel any kind of inclination to join one over the other?
No.
I guess that's kind of an agnostic viewpoint.
Yeah. So, but I also have no reason to, I mean, I've got no inclination to favour that kind of personal God. Taking it that most people in those three religions think that God's a person, over the kind of more impersonal Eastern approaches where they're monotheistic. I don't see any reason to favour that either.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for your insights on that. One final question. So on the I really appreciate as well at the end of your book you have a kind of a list of references or further reading. That's really useful. I like it when authors do that. Um, and it made me think, if I were to ask you which theists you would recommend people read, theists that you respect, that you think are have really good books, have really good arguments, not good enough, of course, but good to some extent. Um, which books from theists would you actually recommend?
So it depends what your interest is. I mean, if you kind of want to be at where um, discussion in academic philosophy of religion in North America is at right now, there's lots of really good people. So I like reading Josh Rasmussen. I think his stuff's really clear and really interesting. I quite like Alex Proust, and those two have written together as well. And he's, for example, his work on Gödel's ontological argument is just really good. That might not be quite the question that you're asking, though. Sort of the where in academic philosophy are the kind of people that, and there are lots of people. There are lots of people there that are good to read. People like Daniel Howard Snyder, Mike Bergman. There are lots and lots of people. I mean, it's kind of invidious to start naming names because then I think, oh, well, I've forgotten these other people, right? I'm less sure about sort of outside academic philosophy, what to recommend. And one thing that I found, this is not quite answering your question now, but one thing that I found really interesting is a sort of COVID project. I started reading some stuff about the history of religions, the Mediterranean religions. So there's this really nice 2-volume history. I think it's OUP. It's either OUP or CUP, but I think it's the Oxford History of Religions that sort of takes you from the Babylonians and the Sumerians up until the point where Islam is just about to kind of conquer a large part of Europe. And I found that really helpful and really interesting to read. And I guess thinking about what to read here, outside of the kind of philosophers and theologians, I also strongly recommend diving into the recent social science on religious belief as well. There's lots of interesting stuff there. So I really like Scott Atran's book, It's a Bit Old Now, In Gods We Trust, the sort of
I've got that.
anthropological
Yeah, I've got that
perspective.
one there. Yeah.
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 And his Ara Norense and his partner, the kind of Big Gods book, that's also really worth having a look at as
So
well.
what was it?
So
The Big Gods
I
book,
can't
did you
remember what it's
say?
called. I can't remember the exact title, but it's about
Okay.
big gods.
Okay.
Big
Okay.
gods.
Yeah.
And so I think reading around in other disciplines, history, but also anthropology and so on, is, and then the kind of social science and the kind of people doing experiments on things like trust, whether atheists are more or less trustworthy than,
Yeah.
and
Which you
that kind of
touched on a
stuff.
bit, didn't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all really worth looking into, right? I
Mm.
mean, it doesn't quite answer your
Well,
question.
no. I think you expanded on the question actually. Yeah. No, I'd agree. Looking into the perceptions of atheists, like you did, and of theists, and pointing this sword at both ends. Um, that was a really interesting part of your book as well. Yeah. Thank you so much for talking to me. It was a really interesting discussion, and it's a lot for me to think about. And yeah, once again, I'm going to promote your book, Atheism: The Basics. Fantastic introductory piece to atheism, and yeah, I personally recommend it highly. I think you did a great job. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, well, keep up the good work, and perhaps we'll talk again soon. Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
that'd be good.